From the Time Machine to 1984 all the way to the Hunger Games, dystopias have only gotten more popular over time. This could be because the stories they tell and the worlds they explore seem increasingly similar to our own. Looking at all the seemingly unsolvable issues within our own society leads us to that very question. Are we today also living in a dystopia? Well, it's one.
This is what my opinion is. I think that in some cases this is true, but I also think that we are living in the most prosperous and best time in the entire history of humankind. Like, we have more access and more resources than anybody else that's ever had, but there are some inadequacies and some things that people don't have that are really big. It's not even close. Yeah, by far.
Understand whether our world qualifies as one, we really need to just figure out what a dystopia actually is, and what sets dystopian media apart from other genres. At the most basic level, it can be understood as the mirror image of a utopia. While a utopian society is either close or has already attained perfection, a dystopia is the opposite. It's a world where negative aspects of society or massive looming problems dominate everything else. It could be nearly anything, from out of control technology to an oppressive regime, or even the consequences of some cataclysmic world-changing event. As long as you've got that, the only restriction is that society still needs to exist. While it wouldn't be very nice to live in a world where the zombie apocalypse has taken place, if wider society has already broken down, then it wouldn't be a dystopia. So this is the nuts and bolts of the genre, but it still doesn't really tell us anything about why people like the genre or how much a dystopia resembles our own world.
I think the reason why dystopia stuff and sci-fi stuff especially is very popular is because of the philosophical aspect of it. Like, a lot of dystopia, like if you look at Blade Runner, if you look at Hunger Games, or you look at anything like 1984, there's a lot of philosophy that's involved with it. And I think that that's what makes it compelling and interesting to people, is because they can see the parallels. It's the relatability, exactly.
A key byproduct of how messed up the world has become is that we've got plenty of material here to help us along. When the world shut down in early 2020, it was pretty easy to see why people thought we were living in a dystopia. Between the empty streets and the 24/7 news coverage, it was almost impossible to go through your day without being confronted by it all. It wasn't surprising that in the first 2 months of the outbreak, the game Plague Inc. saw its global downloads more than double, pushing it towards the top of the App Store charts. Its gameplay of managing the spread of a pathogen was all the more relevant. The film Contagion, which depicts an imaginary flu pandemic, also saw a massive burst of interest. It went from being the 270th most popular movie straight into the iTunes top 10 for digital downloads.
Jesus.
These jumps in popularity were pretty predictable, really. In the same way that any movie which seems to predict the future will see renewed interest. If audiophobic aliens really did invade, then A Quiet Place would probably see a meaty bump in sales, at least among people who don't mind reading subtitles. But while Contagion and Plague Inc. aren't really dystopias either, it does illustrate the key behind what's made the genre what it is today. Dystopias are based on taking a problem with our own world and magnifying it until it dominates and defies everything. If you're a writer or any kind of artist, there's clearly more value in doing this with negative aspects of society compared to the good parts.
I think also, even the ones that are the good parts, there's usually some sort of double-edged sword element to it, where it's yeah, it's good, but, or yes, everything is great except. And that's usually what's being discussed, because, movies need to have usually some kind of conflict that you're working through to solve, of course.
Be boring to read or watch a film about a true utopia, as there isn't really any conflict or stakes when the problems have already been solved. But dystopian media, on the other hand, can tell us something about our own world. By magnifying a real problem through the lens of fiction, we get a different, more detailed look at it than we could get on our own. By making the problem define the entire story, it lets us focus completely on it. In our own lives, there's too many other things that get in the way, and it's in this way that dystopian media helps us take control over these daunting, practically unsolvable problems that we're faced with today. While there isn't much surviving philosophy on how to make a dystopia, there's plenty of philosophers who try to do the opposite and figure out what makes a perfect society. Some of them
yeah, that usually hasn't worked, right? Yeah, see, you're never going to have this work or fit together because people are not perfect. You're always going to have assholes that make things worse. And the best thing that you can do is have, safety rails for whenever that happens. We had a different time. Yeah, looking for Utopia and Space Race. Yeah, of course.
never really saw their plans put into action. Plato's idea of an idealized society involved a strict caste system ruled over by mathematician, philosopher kings. But as far as we know, nobody ever really tried this. Other ideas were more successful. Confucius and his ideas about society laid the bedrock for over 2,000 years of Chinese history. By far the most impactful utopian philosophy of recent history began with Hegel, a 19th century German philosopher. He saw history as a slow, inevitable march towards an enlightened, free society. In his view, everything was leading up to that utopian point, and it's an essential part of his theory of dialectics. But while we might not have reached that point yet, we have seen one of his students' theories put into practice. Marx took Hegel's ideas and applied them to a struggle between the workers and an oppressive ruling class.
See, this is the problem with things like Karl Marx, is that a lot of this is actually true. Like, a lot of the solutions may not work in the way that he says they should work, but it's very evident that, you know, there is basically a class war that is going on. That's why so many people, like, pay attention to what he's talking about, even now.
History, this internal struggle played out time and time again, inevitably leading to a communist utopia after the workers finally triumphed. But unfortunately, this never really happened either. In fact, when communists got into power, it led to some of the most dystopian and oppressive societies ever. Whether it's a fault with people or it's a fault with communism itself, doesn't really matter for our purposes. The fact remains that these utopian ideas enabled one of the most oppressive dystopian regimes in history. The Soviet Union even directly inspired one of the dystopias we'll talk about later. But it's clear
I think the problem is, like, in a lot of, I feel like one parallel is that when things are going very bad, it's usually illegal or not allowed to talk about how bad they are. And I think that one parallel with a lot of, like, the dystopia type stuff is that you can't, or you're not able to, or nobody listens to you speaking out. Because I think usually, like, talking about things and being able to, like, speak out against them makes it to where, you know, it becomes less possible for things to get very bad, right? But the issue is that when media is controlled, or when, you know, dissenting speech is illegal, then you have the real big problems. Sounds accurate for today? Well, I think that most of the time, like, if you think about, like, a lot of the bad and, like, oppressive regimes, pretty much every single one of them is, like, massively censorship. Like, huge amounts of censorship. And I would even say there's a correlation between the more censorship a place has, the worse the place is. I think that's usually what happens. UK moment? Yeah.
Utopian thinking and the lengths people go to achieve it can easily lead to a dystopian society instead. Once the ends justify the means, any amount of suffering becomes excusable to reach the end goal.
And that's also, like, another component. And it's kind of like what I was saying before about how the people that are doing the death threats and everything on Twitter, those people, the reason why they're doing it is because they genuinely think that they're on the right side of history. They think that they're the good guys and they're fighting the good fight. And I think that's one of the really big differences that happens, is that once you tell somebody that you're on the right side of history and everybody that you're fighting against is like an evil, terrible person, then it becomes a lot easier to dehumanize them and to treat them like, you know, basically like to do anything that you want to these people, basically.
Some theories that don't directly describe how to create a dystopia, but they do predict that the slide into a dystopian society is inevitable. One of my favorite TV shows is Mr. Robot, and you can probably tell by the amount of times we use the clips in the show. But did you ever see the mail service they use in the show? Well, they're actually today's sponsor, ProtonVPN. The VPN that is taking over the world with its massive global network. ProtonVPN offers a vast server network of 8,600 servers in over 110 countries, with high-speed connections up to 10 gigabytes per second using VPN Accelerator. And with over 100 million users.
How the fuck are there this many VPNs? Like, am I the only person that's noticed this? That, like, every single fucking YouTube video has a VPN ad? How is there this much money in VPNs? It's crazy.
They've been featured in the New York Times and Time magazine because ProtonVPN stands out. They operate out of Switzerland, which is protected by strong privacy laws. Proton's journey began with Proton Mail, their encrypted email service, but now they offer a complete privacy ecosystem. ProtonVPN, Proton Drive for secure file storage, and Proton Pass for encrypted password management. So why should you use ProtonVPN? Well, because they hide your IP address, letting you browse privately and access content from around the world. From streaming, you can watch shows and sports from anywhere by changing your IP location. application. If you're a gamer, you can benefit from accessing cloud services and avoiding throttling. And even if you're not a gamer, using Proton VPN protects your online activities and access social networks securely. And with their P2P file sharing, you're safeguarded from malware and restricted sites. And NetShield blocks ads and trackers for a better browsing experience.
That's
and on
for
top
Twitch right there. It's the ads are so bad now, especially trackers and shit like that. I mean, you can't be surprised that people are looking for every way to get around it.
But they're
so
also
bad.
dedicated to privacy with a strict no logs policy, independently verified by auditors, and
VPN,
open source code for complete transparency, allowing you to enjoy secure access to content including Netflix and torrenting. Proton's trusted reputation and accessible plans, starting at just $3.99. So try Proton VPN today by using the link in the description below to learn more and safeguard your online freedom with Proton. The general idea these theories share is that something about technology and scientific progression leads to a dystopia. Either we're guaranteed to abuse the tools it gives us, making the world worse, or the technology changes society itself and creates the conditions that lead to a dystopia. Ted Kaczynski, otherwise known as the Unabomber,
this fucking guy. Oh my god.
was just one of the people who believed in these ideas. Now, he had some insane thoughts on how to try and change things, and seemed delusional that he could even affect things in any way. But the basic ideas in his manifesto are lucid, and it was even used as evidence that he was very capable of knowing his actions were wrong, as it was a very well written manifesto.
No, there are lots of other people that have said many of the same things that the Unabomber said.
With many interesting thoughts. You see, he thought that industrial society and technology was slowly stripping people of their natural freedom, whilst destroying the natural world in the process. The outward benefits of technology are enough to convince people to just let this happen, but he ignores just how much of an impact modern technology has in making people's lives better in general. For starters, lots of the people watching this today would be dead if not for modern medicine. Modern agriculture means that most people don't have to slave away in the fields, and bad weather doesn't generally lead to mass famine anymore. There's even the fact that as a country becomes more industrialized and more developed, it also becomes more likely that it's a democracy rather than a dictatorship.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, that's the thing, is I feel like being able to, people being able to like vote on what they want, like democratically, this is the logical way to do things that's best for most people, right? Just by the nature of like what it is. So yeah, usually if things are going well, things move in that direction, of course.
Every metric, it does seem like technology has made the world better for most people, at least so far. The past 20 years or so have started to bring some very big doubts into people's minds. When new technologies get developed today, it often seems like the negatives massively outweigh the benefits. The internet and instant global communication has led to social media and all the damage that's done to society as well. It also pushed mass surveillance and data harvesting into overdrive. AI promises to be the next big thing, but some of its most popular uses include role-playing with a fake girlfriend or replacing the Earth's need for humans in the first place.
I don't like that. I think that AI has a lot of very good uses that transcend having AI girlfriends. Like, people use AI in medicine, they use it in all kinds of creation. It's not like, oh wow, AI is this bad thing and all it does is allow you to steal other people's art. Like, that's not really how AI used. Yeah, like for science, etc. So I just feel like, again, a lot of times people's perception on a lot of these like types of technology, they're very narrow, and it's based around like how this technology will affect entertainment and not necessarily how the technology will affect anything outside of that. So people are thinking about it in terms of like getting a girlfriend or like movies or something like that. But people use these tools all the time and they're very useful. Great for recipes, actually. Yeah, exactly. And so like there's always going to be a bad side to all types of technology. It's the same as like if you look at a lot of tools can be effectively used as weapons, right? Like, I mean, you know, look at a scythe or like a pickaxe or something like that. That's a pretty good fucking weapon. So it's really not with the tool, it's with the people that are using the tool. That's really the problem. AI started for sex. Well, it's working pretty well. Nuclear energy?
Gives the impression that at some point in the past few decades, technology became more destructive than constructive for society. And if this trend...
Completely disagree with this. I think technology has made us more comfortable and better off than we ever have been. And I think that the problem that we've had actually is the fact that, like, I mean, this is kind of what the Unabomber was saying, is that people will live in such a life that is completely devoid of any sense of like real struggle or ownership of anything that, you know, makes a person a person. It's like, for example, like if you look at like the entire time of human history, And then you think about the amount of time that we have where people work at desk jobs, you're looking at literally a percentage of time that is less than 0.1%. So 99.9% of our time, evolutionarily, we've been working physically, moving around. Like, the human body's made to move around a lot, right? And so if you have a person that's not doing that at all, you are effectively acting against your best nature. And so what happens is that, you know, it's like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where at the very top you have self-actualization, which is the hardest thing to do, really. And when everybody is at that top point of the pyramid, that's whenever you get a lot of these like dystopia projections. But the reason why you're getting this dystopia projection is because everything below that is totally taken care of. That's what I think.
Does exist and it does continue into the future, it will lead to a dystopian society if it hasn't already.
Yeah.
With all of that said, we can get down to the specifics. The question of whether our world is a dystopia might be best answered by people's personal experiences. If the world's problems are preventing someone from having a good and meaningful life, then for all intents and purposes they're living in a dystopia. But what are those specific problems? Well, let's go through these problems and look at the dystopian media that analyzes them. While it's definitely outshined by other big problems with society, population collapse is a growing concern for nearly all of the world. The media doesn't really focus on it because it doesn't bring in any ratings. It's a gradual problem of statistics and trend lines. But when you examine it more closely, it could shake the very foundations on which our society is built. Modern economies are dependent on growth. If a country's economy stops growing for just a few months, it slips into recession and millions of people see the standard of living drop, often for years afterwards. Part of this assumption that the economy will just keep growing is built onto the idea that there will always be more people to fill all of the jobs that society needs.
I feel like at a certain point, you've got to kind of blame that on the system, right? Like, you can't just blame it on people. Like, if you have a system that just like, oh, everything is always going to get bigger forever, I feel like this is kind of a bad way of basing things on, right? I mean, yeah, what are you talking about?
Population collapse through a system.
Yeah, exactly.
As it stands today, large parts of the working population in nearly all developed countries are set to enter retirement over the next few decades.
But this is going to happen to, I think, over half of jobs. I think that in 30 years, it will no longer be socially expected for you to have a job as an adult, because so many things will be automated.
There's far fewer people being born or entering the workplace to fill this gap. It means that the world is already dealing with a large dependent population compared to a small proportion of working, economically productive people. It's not the kind of problem that seems like it would create a dystopia all on its own, unless you dial this up to 11. That's the scenario that the 2006 film Children...
This movie was so fucking good. Oh my god. If you haven't seen this movie, you should absolutely watch it. This is an S-tier movie.
Of Men explores. The film is set in an alternate future where nobody has been able to have children for 2 decades,
bought it at Blockbuster.
pushing society to the edge. Developing countries have almost entirely collapsed without a working population to keep them sustained. Richer, developed countries are a bit better off, but the massive amounts of refugees combined with the economic hardship have pushed them deep into authoritarianism. The film revolves around an apathetic civil servant trying to protect humanity's last chance at a brighter future, the only baby to be born in years. A lot of the movie's strength isn't in the plot though. Instead, it's the background information and the details that really tie the film together. There's so much there to make it feel authentic. Some of the details that fans have noticed really show how much thought they put into this. While the film was released years before the Shard was built in London, the film is set in the future so it's visible in the skyline. Then
it's kind of crazy how, if you look at a lot of the clips here, and you look at how it is now, man, it's not that far off.
Then there's the underlying detail that people have become even more obsessed with their pets because they're trying to fill the hole that children left. A lot of the political commentary and the details of the overarching story are left in the background as well. As we mentioned earlier, dystopian media often amplifies and magnifies things going on in our own world, and this is no exception. The two sides of the conflict in Children of Men are both distortions of today's political divide. The rich and powerful are depicted as fascist oppressors, living in their own little bubbles, oblivious to the suffering going on around them. They hoard art from the old world, but it's all meaningless because it's been taken out of the world which gave it context, and soon nobody will be around to appreciate it. They keep this shaky establishment in place with propaganda, brutal reprisals and oppression. You would expect the film's version of the left to therefore be the good guys, fighting to take down the oppressive system, but instead they're just much more morally grey. One of the first action scenes—
That's one of the reasons why this movie is extremely good. It's because it presents the topic in a non-one-dimensional way. And that's one of the things that I think that a lot of people are tired of media with, because this is a big problem, is that I feel like nowadays a lot of media doesn't respect the intelligence of the watcher or the viewer, and they have to constantly remind you that these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. Hey, in case you weren't paying attention, they're bad, they're good, right? So yeah, fantastic movie. Yeah, exactly.
Is later revealed to be an inter-faction assassination plot, for example.
Of course.
And it shows how divided and power-hungry they really are, trying to use humanity's last hope as a political tool. They clearly want to tear down the old order, but that's the only thing they're unified by. At the end of the film, in a big battle scene, they're still just as violent and threatening to the last hope of humanity as the government has been. The whole political conflict running through the movie is framed as the result of hopelessness for the future. But when they see that hope, and they see the baby at the end of the movie, it's one of the most powerful moments in the film. All the conflict and the fighting just stops when they can see that there is still hope. Children of Men does a great job of visualizing our worst fears when it comes to population collapse, but it goes even deeper than that. The film explores the problems with a decaying society. The fact that it's all so intuitive and recognizable shows us a lot about our own world today. The deep resemblance—
I do think that technology and how good it is going to make people dumber, and I think it's already started happening. I think there's a huge problem now that a lot of kids don't have to critically solve problems because technology has gotten so good that it solves all of those problems for you. You don't have to think about how can you get 30% of something. You just have an app that does that. You don't have to think about how can I spell something. You just have an app that spells it for you. And it's not like one thing that's the problem, because like there are, so like tools like calculators, I don't think are this kind of a problem. But tools that do the calculating for you are the problem. And it's not even that it's a problem, but it's a side effect to improving technology, is that the ability to critically think is no longer important. Basically, it's not as important as it used to be because you have machines that can critically think for you. And that way, you're not exercising that part of your brain. And you, I think, if you don't lose it, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? That's it. Percentage? Yeah, it's exactly what's happening. And the crazy thing is that in a lot of types of technology, like in these dystopias, like I think Idiocracy is the best example, right? That there's very commonly a type of alien technology that nobody understands that is in fact, it was the progenitor of like whatever some apocalypse situation was, where it's like, yeah, we have all these machines, but nobody knows how the machines work anymore.
Definitely pushes us towards the conclusion that we are in fact living in a dystopia. But it also definitely helps that the movie is trying to imagine what our times would look like. It's a very realistic, close to home dystopia set only a few years from the current day. A different test would be to see how our world stacks up against a dystopia that seems like it's much more different to our world. One where flying cars, cyborgs, and other futuristic technology—
I think that there are a lot of people that live in dystopia, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the world is a dystopia. So like there are people that have really bad like living conditions for whatever reason, and those people are living in this situation, but that's not necessarily always the fault of society. Sometimes it's the individual's fault or something like that.
Are everywhere. Like the world of Blade Runner 2049, cyberpunk as a genre and Blade Runner in particular focuses on what it means to be human and where we should draw the line between human and machine. In the film, we see a world where every intangible part of humanity has been figured out and replicated, then turned into a product. These human-like machines or replicants are everywhere in the film, and they're treated like a lower class of individual. They're human in pretty much every single way except for the fact they still can't have children of their own. It's the final barrier yet to be broken down by technology, and Blade Runner 2049's world uses it as justification for their slavery. The story follows Kay, a replicant whose job it is to hunt down other replicants that have gone rogue and rebelled against their programming. In the process, he discovers the body of a replicant who has given birth. It's a discovery that could change the whole society's view on replicants, but as we'll find out, it's also something which could seal the fate of replicants as lower class citizens forever. Wallace, the de facto corporate overlord of the world and the creator of the replicants, also wants to find the promised child. Replicants are still expensive and slow to create, meaning they still can't fully replace people. If he can unlock that final secret, it'll perfect his product and give him pretty much total control. It's this fact that makes the film feel so close to home, despite all the futuristic technology and skyscraper-sized holograms. It's a world caught in an awkward middle phase, stuck between the past and a utopian future. If non-sentient replicants were perfected and there were enough of them, you could imagine freeing up enough resources for everyone to have a good life. But instead, there's scarcity and the tyrannical control of—
I think the real problem is that, and this is the issue with like all types of like AI and like automation, The problem is that with a lot of these types of tools, it's not like when the machines take over your job, you just get to go home and then they send you your paycheck every day. You get fired, and then your paycheck now goes back to the company, and then the company takes that money instead. So that's really where the issues are. It's that when you have these types of people that are consolidating all of the wealth and like the means of production along a very, very small subset of people, what that's going to do is, I've said this before, I think it's going to create feudalism again. I think that's exactly what's going to happen. And I think that if we don't have like laws to kind of prevent that, what's going to end up happening is that people will basically become vassals of other people that are wealthy and control those means of production. And we're going to go right back to where we were in like the fucking Middle Ages. Because like how else could people provide any value? Techno-feudalism? Yeah, I think that's what's going to happen. And I think also like you're seeing it happen a lot in like a very abstract sense with like, Uber Eats, with, DoorDash, with Uber, with all of these other types of services that basically just exist to give people with more resources more convenience. And I think that that's basically how things are going to go in that direction, is that more and more people's job will be functionally to create more convenience for a person that has more money than them. And I think that's what's kind of happening. And I think it's already happening. How do we fix it? We have like laws to like tax people and, like redistribute money, right? I mean, clearly, like that's what you have to have.
Corporations has made the world even more unequal. All the wealth and power is hoarded by the ruling corporate class. The rest of the world is left in an even worse position. We see this in the film when he visits the factory that is all still held up by child labor and oppression. The technology that promised salvation for the masses has instead only deepened those gaps. It mirrors the way that technology seems to be impacting our world today. We're constantly told about how innovations like AI are going to make the economy more productive and therefore make people's lives better. But as we've gotten more advanced, people are increasingly seen as numbers on a spreadsheet. The further we go, the more the world—
I think that this was always true. Like, if you go and you look back in history, I'm pretty sure whenever people had massive wars and a bunch of people went and got killed, I'm pretty sure the kings weren't really getting upset, like, oh, wow, we had a bunch of people get killed. Yeah, it's disappointing, but, like, they don't really give a shit about it. So I don't think this is any sort of, like, new development at all. Yeah, this is an always has been situation. Yeah, exactly. It's just a number. Exactly. Well, people are just a number. Like, everybody likes to put a very high value on their own life and their own humanity. But the reality is that most people, pretty much all people, are to one degree or another replaceable. They are. And I think that that's like not really a good way to look at it, but it's an accurate way to look at it. And I've learned this with, like, I mean, how many of you guys have had like a job or you've been in like a guild in WoW or something like that? And it's like, oh, this person isn't replaceable. And they leave and you replace them and you figure out a way to do it, right? Like, life goes on, people move on. That's it.
Seems to alienate people. Despite massive improvements in productivity and wealth creation, tons of people are just poorer and have less opportunities than they had.
This is because of the government. The government hasn't held any of these companies accountable for this. The problem is that people that make a lot of money don't pay enough money into the social systems, and so you have a bunch of people that are homeless and crackheads. Like, that's basically what happens. But the average person, yeah, high-performing individuals, not easily replaceable. It is harder to replace them, for sure. Absolutely.
10 or even 50 years ago. The world of Blade Runner 2049 has gone further on this path than ours has. Corporations are publicly in full control of every branch of the government, for example, rather than just pulling the strings from the background. But the fact that we're even on this path to begin with betrays a dystopian quality about our modern world, and how it doesn't seem like it's designed for people anymore. This is just one small—
Well, it's designed for people that make money. That's really it. Is that I don't even think that it's something, I don't think it's ever been. It's never been between people and robots. It's been between people that control ownership of production and people that don't. And it's always been a class fight. It's not about like people versus robots. It's the rich people that control all of these resources and all of these tools versus people that don't have any control of it, and they can't really like break into any sort of like value or do anything for themselves. It's not anymore. Yeah, I think it's happening already. People don't work or make themselves valuable. That's why this is happening. Well, the thing is that how can a person make themselves valuable in a world where almost every single job is done by a robot that's more effective than a person could ever be? Because, like, for example, if you look at the way that, like, an app, I think this is a good way to look at it. Like, you guys have all used calculators before, and you've probably used a calculator to, like, calculate, like, the trajectory of a graph or something like that, like TI-84, etc. These machines can do it better than any human can do at a faster ratio. And it's not even remotely close. There are people that are really, really good at math, and they're like insanely like gifted, like savants in math. And they are not even 1% of the efficiency and effectiveness of a machine or a computer. It's not even remotely close.
Part of the themes explored by Blade Runner 2049, of course. To get a more detailed breakdown, check out our full video on the movie. We've seen 2 dystopian societies so far that have turned into dystopias by outside forces. Either the progression and misuse of technology in the case of Blade Runner, or a global fertility crisis in Children of Men. But these aren't necessary. All you need for a dystopia is a society that's reliant or even designed to create its own misery. Enter 1984, the essential and possibly the most oppressive dystopian society ever imagined. There's a reason that 1984 has had such a huge impact on culture. It explains the workings of an oppressive society incredibly well. Even decades later, and nothing else gives us the same tools to accurately deconstruct the totalitarianism of our own world, which we've also done a huge video on before.
I think also a big reason why this happened is because 1984 is specifically, like, so George Orwell wrote this, I think, after he was working in like France or Spain or something like that. I don't remember exactly the details, but it might have been Italy and Europe. And so he's writing this, like 1984 is actually a very, very recent, like thing. I think it came out in 1948. The book the book came out. And so it's more relevant to us, obviously, because it's like a modern critique on like Western culture. I think that's another big reason why.
The world of 1984 is defined by stagnation. The ideology of the ruling party and the world they created is expertly designed to suppress and dominate every other part of life. One of the most striking parts of Orwell's dystopia is what the party has done to language. Normal languages like the kind that we use don't exist in a vacuum. Every word or phrase we say only has any meaning based on the context in which it's said. The philosopher Wittgenstein explains this through his theory of language games. Take the word cut, for example. If you read it in a recipe, it's probably referring to something about chopping vegetables. But a director shouting it on a movie set would make the word mean something completely different. All words are like this, they're all dependent on the specific language game that you're playing at the time. They're just building blocks. In 1984 though, even this freedom is in the process of being suppressed. Orwell imagined the party creating a new language called Newspeak, where most of the linking words have been taken out, while other words have been changed or removed entirely. The result is a language which has barely any building blocks and where the context has already been decided. I
think that we've had this happen a lot. Like, and this is a huge component. This is probably one of the most like interesting things is that the way that people use language and the way that they try to like twist language to turn it into like something that's totally different. And like, for example, people use like undocumented immigrant instead of illegal alien, for example. And so like people try to redefine vocabulary in order to make their ideas seem like they're more accurate or they're better. And I think this happens with everything, the ick, illegal or immigrant or something like that, like calling normal people cis. Yeah, I think that's a good example, like gender, male and female, woke. Yep, there's definitely another one. Changing the word for Nazi, right? And so like all of these words have been turned into and weaponized into ways that you can effectively suppress people's thought by making people think, oh my God, I can't use this word. If somebody calls me this word, now I'm the bad guy. And I think it's, maps. Oh, yes, minor attracted persons. Oh, God, is there any better example than that? I certainly fucking hope not. Yes, 100%. This is super fucking common. Unhoused people rather than homeless people. And so all of these things are changes in vocabulary in order to elicit a more emotional reaction or to change people's perceptions or shift their perception towards thinking about it in a way that's more sympathetic towards the people that are using this vocabulary or have invented the vocabulary.
works, and you can only understand it in the context of submitting to a party rule.
Yeah.
Rebellion and disagreement within the party line is therefore impossible to even comprehend when using newspeak. As we've said before, dystopian media often amplifies...
And this is what happens now. And this is what I've always found to be like the most interesting about George Orwell. It's like, I think he predicted this perfectly. Because I think also another very big component for this is that, like, you know, he was around about the same time, and like, when like the whole idea of like Nietzsche was like really, really fucking popular, and like the idea of like the death of God. I think that people have used a lot of the like these like political systems and like political dogma, like ideologies. They've replaced religion with these ideologies. And so now it's like, if you go against that, you're basically a fucking blasphemer, right? I mean, like, this is like, oh my God, it's heresy. And so now, and like, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but if you noticed somebody like in media maybe that's like kind of gone a little bit off track, and then they get treated like they're this terrible person. I think a really good example of this that you could use would be somebody like, you know, maybe Jordan Peterson, J.K. Rowling, somebody like that who, you know, aligned with 90% of these values, but they diverged in that 10 or 5 or 1%. Joe Rogan's another one that then, as soon as that happens, as soon as you show any type of like hesitancy to completely embrace a mindset, you are immediately treated as if you are like absolutely opposed to them. And I think this has happened a lot. And I think it's radicalized a lot of people. Anna Kasparian? Yeah, from the Young Turks. I think that is another really good example. You're right about that.
Things we see in our own world today. And while we haven't created a whole new language yet, we have seen certain words and phrases getting removed from our language completely.
Facebook groups say they were just censored for using the word men. That sounds like bullshit to me. Like, I'm sorry, it sounds like such bullshit. But I do think that this happens in some cases where like some words are being considered to be like bad because people have just decided that. Tired of hearing heresy? I want to talk about heresy. Yeah, exactly. Jordan Peterson's a total lunatic. I think that when Jordan Peterson went against calling people by like their own invented pronouns, I think that the truth is that 80% or 90% of people agree with him, at least here in the United States. I think a super majority of people agree with that. So, and this is the problem, is that he did go off the deep end, but you're talking about like, why did he go off the deep end? One of the reasons why is that he was a conscientious person who saw what seemed to be, at least in his mind, as tyranny or oppression, and he spoke out against it, and then he was treated as if he was the oppressor or he was the tyrannical one. And this alienated him further, and it made him more extreme. I think another good example of this is like Nick Merckx. So Nick Merckx was like talking about how he didn't want to have like trans or like gay ideology in like schools. And then people treated him as if like he wanted to kill gay people. And so what did that do? Well, that pushed him farther away, and it radicalized him even more towards the other perspective. And so not extreme. Well, what I'm saying is they're treated as if they're extreme. I don't want to argue whether you think they're extreme or not. Russell Brand is another example. Yeah. And so what happens is that, and this also happens to right-wing people too, but like, you know, that's kind of like in like the 2000s, I think that happened a lot more, like right after September 11th. But like, you know, we're kind of at a different place in the pendulum right now. Anyway, so this happens a lot, and people end up getting pushed away. And I think it's true with many cases. Like another case too is Destiny. Like, I think Destiny's very clearly like a liberal guy, but there's a lot of people in like that community that don't like Destiny at all for that reason. And it's because he's diverged from some of their thinking in different ways, right? And so, yeah, ultra liberal, exactly. And so all of these things happen. And then for some people, it ends up pushing them even farther against the original group that they thought that they were a part of. And so I think language is a huge way that that's enforced.
And social media is one of the biggest culprits. There's plenty of words which would be more accurate, but we can't actually say them because of YouTube's arbitrary rules. It's all the
gay and lesbian. What is this here? Includes gay and lesbian, but not straight or heterosexual. Yeah, I don't know if this is true. I mean, we say shit like that all the time. I don't think I'm getting demonetized for that, but it's hard to say.
It's all a way to restrict language so that things people talk about fit into the sanitized corporate context which they want to force on people. All the stuff we...
Yeah, and this is another thing too, right? Woke UN agency bans the word Englishman because it's too gendered. This is the kind of stuff that I think a lot of average, like, you know, your Walmart Americans, people are just kind of fed up with stuff like this, right? Because it's kind of like, whenever I see something like this, it reminds me of the South Park episode where they flew the whale to the moon, where it's like you did something that is actually just bad, it's oppressive, and it adds no value, it's just stupid, and you're acting like you're doing something good. This crap's so exhausting. Exactly, yeah. And it, like Latinx, there's so many examples of this, right? And I think that this is also, like, it's not even just with language. I think if you take a step back and you look at what really is the incentive here, people don't like being told what to do. They don't like being ordered around. They don't like having their opinions and their viewpoints dictated to them. And they don't like being talked down to. And because of that, you gain a tremendous amount of resentment from that group of people when you're just basically telling them and talking down to them and saying, like, oh yeah, you need to believe this, you need to think that, like, if you don't, you're a bad person, etc. Especially by weirdos. Yeah. And so stop calling us Latinx. It's so fucking racist. Well, and that's the problem, right? Is that people like this are more, the reason why they keep using the term Latinx is because they're not concerned with being racist. They're concerned with looking like they're good people. So they are more than willing to sacrifice your culture and your language on the altar of putting themselves up in a higher position. They want to seem like they're a good person, and so they're willing to do that for any reason. Girl Scout cookies are called Samoas rather than Samoas are now called generic caramel coconut rings or some trash. Yeah, it's just weird. And I think this is the issue too. And people just don't like being told what words they can and can't use, because why would you want to have somebody telling you what to do? It's pretty fucking simple when you think about it.
All the stuff we've been talking about seems to confirm our worst fears, that we are living in a dystopia. The fact that our society embodies so many dystopian qualities seems to confirm this, but it still isn't the full picture. There's still one part of dystopian media that we haven't actually fully discussed, and that's the theme of hope, which is always present in some way or another. Some dystopian stories have a positive ending, which implies that the society moved on from this phase and got better in some way. Children of Men is like that, for example.
Yeah, sure.
It's all about the power of hope. Others, like 1984, seem like they end with all hope having been extinguished. The main character of Winston eventually succumbs to indoctrination and loses his humanity. But even in the bleakest dystopia imaginable, that hope still exists somewhere. The parts of life the party is trying to suppress and make people forget will always exist. However,
I think also, like, another really big component, like I was saying this earlier, is that I can't think of a single dystopia story that's, like, really bad where censorship is not one of the primary ways that it's maintained. Like, censorship and oppression in one way or another. Like, people do not have freedom of expression somehow. And I think that's usually the case. Like, if you look at any oppressive regime, you know, look at, like, imperial, like, China, or you look at North Korea, or, like, Russia, or you look at, like, a lot of these other countries that are, like, really shitty, the one thing that pretty much all of them have in common is that you don't have freedom of expression. And it's almost like the less freedom of expression you have, the worse they are. Minority Report? Yeah. In Iran? Yeah. They put a head in a cage and starving rats. Well, I'm just saying in general, that's what happens.
They're hidden. It means that while our world has dystopian qualities and it does seem to be getting worse in lots of ways, we'll never truly live in a real dystopia. The world is just too complex and varied for any one thing or problem to dominate it completely. There's still tons of problems, and for an increasing amount of unlucky people, they come to dominate their individual lives. It doesn't mean that the good parts of life like art, music, hobbies, friends and family aren't there. Our modern world has made it harder and harder to lose yourself in those parts of life. It all gets in the way, and we're bombarded with these dystopian problems constantly. And it's made the skill of being able to tune all of that out even more important.
I think a really big component, sorry, let me pause this real quick. I think a very big component to this too is people that actively consume products and they actively do things that make themselves unhappy. And then in the process of doing that, they blame the world. So there's nobody that's really making you sit and, like, waste 8 hours a day watching TikTok videos. It's not like this was not mandated by the government. You don't have to do this. It's like getting fat. It's like, yes, nobody said you had to go to McDonald's every day and you had to be 500 pounds, right? So, similar to Brave New World, from my understanding. I mean, I think that there's a lot of different examples of it. Yeah, and I think that also, like, nowadays in our culture, the main reason why people believe that they're in a dystopia is because they've created it for themselves. I think that a lot of these people are basically lazy. They have no sense of self-accountability. They don't try to improve their lives, and they just seek to indulge themselves in the easiest and most accessible form of entertainment. And I think that's why people get massively fat. I think that's why people are getting addicted to social media. I think that's why it happens. And it's because people are able to effectively like blame these other things and see like, oh, well, I'm not making myself fat. It's McDonald's making me fat, right? Or something like that. And I feel like a lot of these dystopias that people create for themselves, at least nowadays, because like we're nothing like Blade Runner. It's nothing like 1984. I think that it's majority people with no self-control that are trying to turn themselves into victims when the only person that they're a victim from is themselves. I think that's what's really happening. And that's what happens with almost everybody, is that most people are, you know, at least, and this is, by the way, these are people who live in first world countries. We're not talking about somebody who lives in fucking Africa, right? But I'm talking about like if you're living in America and like, you know, maybe you're not in like the top like 5% of like the poorest people, like you have a tremendous amount of privilege and the ability to like kind of achieve things that people in, you know, historically have never had before. And so it's a first world problems. Yeah, exactly. And so most people that are complaining, like I see this all the time on Twitter, and I'll see people complaining about like how unfair life is, how bad life is, etc. And it's like, okay, well, you're complaining about it, but you have 134,000 tweets and you made your account in 2022. Like, let's do the math here. So it's like, how is it that like the world is against you and like everything is set up for you to fail when you're spending your entire life complaining about it on the internet? And so it's people that take no accountability or anything like that for themselves, and then they blame everybody else. I think that's what happens. What if there is no free will? A lot of scientists believe that we don't. Wouldn't that mean that being lazy and fat is a factor of genetics and environment? I think that there's a spectrum of it where people might not have absolute free will, you know, in instances of like heavy addiction, etc. But at a certain point, a person usually decided and made a free choice to put themselves in a position that was negative. And I also think that the idea that there is no free will, of course there is. There's obviously free will. You know, if you want to move your hand, you want to do this with your hand, you can just do that with your hand. So if you can do whatever you want with your body, assuming that you're not crippled or something like that, then why can't you do something with your mind? Why can't you go and spend your time doing something outside? And so really, there's a certain level of like a priori knowledge that just immediately disproves that. You don't have free will? Okay, well, you can slap yourself in the face. I mean, doesn't that prove that you have free will? I think it kind of does. So most people feel like they don't have it because it's easier for them to convince themselves into a position of learned helplessness. No, it doesn't. Of course it does. How do you not have free will? Can you piss yourself in public on command? I don't know. I've never tried. Maybe I should.